What news stories mattered most this week in the world of media and advertising? Today, we will try to answer that question in 20 minutes or less. I'm Jack Benjamin.
And I'm Ella Sagar.
We're reporters for The Media Leader, and this week we'll be covering the run-up to the Paris 2024 Olympics and the Paralympic Games, the future of the BBC license fee, and much more. Ella, the summer of sport is in full swing. We've had Wimbledon, we've had the Euros. I won't ask you how you feel about the outcome. Sorry about that. And now, as mentioned, we get to look forward to the Olympics. So lots going on this summer. We're just over a week away from Paris 2024. Ella, you've been watching closely a number of developments around Olympic media coverage and advertising. So what should people know about in the UK market?
So for the UK, the BBC and Channel 4 split the Olympics and the Paralympics coverage. So the BBC has a sub-license agreement for the Olympics coverage from Discovery, which is obviously now part of Warner Brothers Discovery. And they'll have their own hosts and such like, but the audiovisual content and all of those streams will come from Discovery. And then Channel 4 has held the Paralympic broadcast rights since the London 2012 Games and has really made that a kind of cornerstone of its whole identity. And, you know, the last leg started as a 2012 Paralympic show, for example, and now is like a mainstay of its Friday night kind of coverage of broadcasting outside of the Paralympics. But obviously they're taking that to Paris as well. And TalkSport this Olympics has got non-exclusive coverage rights for the first time. So that's a commercial radio first. So the BBC will have coverage of, so they both will be running their Olympics coverage. And
Interesting.
Then, and so in terms of like the bigger side of things, Warner Brothers Discovery is doing a huge Olympics and Paralympics coverage across its streaming platforms in multiple markets in multiple languages, and also done partnerships with YouTube and Snap as well, which has been really interesting to see how that has been developing over time.
Yeah, I'll ask you about that in a minute, because I imagine that's mostly outside the UK market, but I know that Warner Brothers Discovery is going bigger in Europe. Mm-hmm. Something that I want to talk about. So there's the BBC.
Yep.
So that's
free to air.
Obviously free to air, ad-free coverage, and then there's also Channel 4. You mentioned TalkSport. In terms of the commercial interest, I imagine those media owners have worked to do a lot around their Olympic coverage, I imagine, right? Yeah,
I've been writing a lot about Channel 4 recently, and I was at their launch event for their Paralympics coverage. And I also have seen they've launched their Paralympics brand campaign. And famously in the 2012, when they took over this coverage, they did an amazing campaign called Superhumans, which had a soundtrack from Public Enemy. And it really just revitalized the sport. And I think the viewership of the Paralympics and how it's perceived as a sport, as they are as athletes, has really changed. But this year, the campaign from Channel 4 is very much, it's moving away from that superhuman narrative for the first time. But in doing that, it's changing. It's trying to bake in accessibility into that, into all of its advertising around the Paralympics, into the sponsorship idents from Allianz and Toyota as well, and making the actual coverage itself with the first like deaf presenter, with Paralympians presenting, with a real focus on diversity as well. So I've never been in that Channel 4 launch event for their Paralympics. It was the most diverse room I've ever been in, with the most care taken about all of the different accessibility needs and everything. And it was an amazing atmosphere to be in. Sounds
like a big wing for inclusion. Absolutely. And really important, of course. And I'm sure brands would want to be all against that. You did mention Warner Brothers Discovery. So I'm curious, you mentioned lots of different things in the European market, and is that part of just a general European growth strategy from that company? I mean, leaning into if you have the Olympics, I would imagine big opportunity, brands want to get involved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say, the previous Olympics, they've been in Tokyo and they've been in Rio. So having one in Europe with this time zone when you're launching a streaming service like Max in Central and Eastern Europe and in France and other markets like the Netherlands and the Nordics, it's kind of a gift, because live sport is one of those few things that will still drive viewers to watch. And they're going to have multiple screen experiences. They're going to have lots of simultaneous kind of broadcasts. They have a presenting team in, I think it is about 19 different languages and 47 markets and over 100 presenters. So they're really leaning into that. But what's interesting is how they're trying to go to YouTube and Snap to capture that 18 to 24 market, because maybe an 18 to 24-year-old might not want to watch like the full day on broadcast or stream it like on Max, but they might want to watch clips from different YouTubers about behind the scenes at the stadiums. And so what they're kind of dubbing it as is going beyond broadcast for that.
Interesting. Okay. Well, something to keep an eye on when all the games kick off. Something else that I wrote about related to the summer of sport coverage just this week was that sport coverage is actually really tricky for publishers, not broadcasters. The Euros and the Olympics tend to be huge traffic drivers because, as you mentioned, it's not just people that are watching, but also wanting to read about all of these events. But a great deal of articles I learned from Mantis this week are still being demonetized because they end up being identified by many brands as not brand safe, even though, of course, they are. You're just writing about sports. And that's because of keyword block lists. And I wrote a piece about how Reach articles in particular suffered this fate during the Euros. This year, there's been lots of coverage in years past about this happening. It's kind of amazing that there hasn't been a lot of progress on it. But the sort of the key figures were that 45% of Reach's Euro 2024 final coverage, which was when England was playing Spain and didn't have a great result, were blocked from having advertising. And likewise, the semifinals coverage had 56% of those articles that would have been blocked from receiving advertising, which is kind of remarkable. And that's because of different sport language being used that would show up on a keyword block list, like shoots or an attacker or something like that.
Yeah. Which seems, when you're not taking the context into account, that seems really out of date. And sport is such a huge audience. So that's a massive missed opportunity for advertisers and for the publisher as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because I often talk to publishers about this type of behavior and sometimes advertisers just being overly cautious and not wanting to spend money on especially political news and maybe war news. And often the response is, well, we've got other sections that we're happy to take your advertising dollars and put you up against that are maybe a little bit more aligned with whatever brand values you want to be seen to be having. But then if that actually isn't happening because of these keyword block lists and just basically brands just not being careful enough about what keywords end up on those block lists or making sure that there's exemptions for trusted news publishers, this can happen anyway. And it's definitely a negative for publishing. Yeah.
I was having conversations recently about unblock lists or kind of safe lists and how there should be some kind of publishers or like verticals that always fall in that kind of brand safe area. I wonder if that's a way to combat this.
There's got to be other solutions that are looked at. I think that's pretty clear from this piece.
Other big news this week is the IPA Bellwether. It's that time again. So that's come out this morning, and I'm curious. So you were covering this for us, and so I'm wondering what the main takeaways were. And normally it's kind of a net balance, upwardly revising their budgets or downwardly revising, and it's kind of by channel as well. So
yeah, that's right. So overall, there's an improved sense of business optimism, and that is leading the companies that were surveyed to increase their marketing budgets at a higher rate than we had seen in actually a decade in terms of net balance. So we're talking about net balance of companies increasing their marketing budgets. That was plus 15.9%. Wow. And that's the highest level, again, since 2014. So that expanded budget is mostly going to expanding events, followed by direct marketing and sales promotions. Now, main media advertising budgets, which we tend to write most about, were increased by a net balance of 3.5% of businesses. And within that, the only budgets that saw increases were what the IPA labels as other online, as well as video. So out-of-home budgets were flat, and audio and publishing budgets declined, which these are all kind of continuations of current trends, more money going to video and online advertising. But yeah, the overall picture is actually really sunny, which is good to be able to report. Quite unusual
for us sometimes, I think, with these reports. Since we started in 2021, some of the reports have not made for happy reading.
Yeah, it's definitely been a difficult macroeconomic environment for a long time now, or at least more challenging than it had been for 12 years of relatively strong growth. But going forward, things are a little bit better. It's worth noting that this survey was done before the general election actually occurred. Now, Labour had been signaling that it would be fairly friendly to businesses and more stable than the prior government, which might be reflected in the survey just in terms of optimism. But what's also important is that there's an expectation that interest rates are going to come down later in the year as inflation has come down, the economy seems to be picking up. The Bank of England might reduce interest rates. That seems to be an expectation by a lot of analysts that I've spoken with. Currently, the interest rate is 5.25%, but the IMF recommended the UK interest rate should fall to 3.5% by the end of this year to help further stimulate that growth. And I think that's being seen in this sort of forecast of what we think our marketing budgets will look like. We'll maybe have more money to throw around. But speaking of the new government, the last main story I wanted to touch on today is that Prime Minister Keir Starmer says he intends to keep the BBC license fee intact until at least 2027. So I should note, Labour had previously committed to the licensing scheme as the BBC's funding model in its manifesto before it was elected. And then more recently, Prime Minister Keir Starmer said, quote, "There's going to be some more thought between now and 2027, but we are committed to the BBC and we are committed to the licensing arrangements." So Ella, I'm curious, why does this matter? We've had a lot written about this in the past, especially by some of our columnists, and I'm curious, was this expected, unexpected, a good thing, bad thing?
I think it's fair to say Labour is expected to be less hostile, I think was the phrase that one of our columnists used, Raymond Snoddy, less hostile to the BBC than the Conservatives. Previously, in most recent years, the Conservative government had frozen the licence fee for 2 years, and the former Culture Secretary Nadine Dorries had mulled in a Twitter thread about scrapping it entirely come 2027 without consulting the House of Commons. So the idea that Lisa Nandy, who's now the Culture Secretary, has to contend with is, what do we do with the funding of the BBC? Is the licence fee going to continue? They have to sign a new charter, and which is an agreement about how the BBC is going to be funded and what its remit is as a public service broadcaster. And so there are a few different options. And there's also the context of the BBC announcing earlier this year that it would potentially look at commercialising its podcasts in the UK.
Right.
It does commercialise its podcasts outside of the UK, but that ruffled a lot of feathers.
It was a very limited,
and it was a limited
way of commercialising.
Yeah, but it was still perceived as very, very much. And also, there's launching spin-off stations for Radio 1, Radio 2, and Radio 3. Commercial radio has got these genre spin-off stations and decade stations and such like. They've invested a lot of money and talent and time into building those, and they're very successful. So it felt very much like a direct imitation, I think, is what Matt Payton from the Radio Centre said. And when it comes to commercialising BBC podcasts, you might think that it grows the pie and it gives advertisers more options and all of that sort of thing. But there is analysis that would show that it would actually result in a market collapse and it wouldn't grow the pie at all. And if it starts with podcasts, then why not do it for your news and for your website and for your TV and radio? And so where would it stop? And that one of the opinion pieces we ran last year was from an excerpt from the book, How Do We Pay for the BBC After 2027? Which is by Roger Parry. And he said that the pool of advertising is not big enough for the BBC to follow an advertising model. You have the license fee model, which also isn't particularly fit for purpose. But
is it what makes it not? I mean, is it just not popular? No one likes to pay a TV license fee? I
think there is a kind of, it was the reasoning that he gave for it was that it was come up with several, however long ago, and that everything's moved on, and so we need a more modern arrangement. So you could have a subscription model, or you could, what he suggested was something from in form of like a central taxation. So there's a lot
just
of different options.
From the government
and
budget,
and so at the moment it doesn't come from the government. It would come from your license fee payers, and it is set at £159 a year at the moment. It's a significant amount, and people are feeling the squeeze, and maybe people feel like they don't use BBC services as much to merit that, and they pay for other subscription services. So I think they're going to have to do a lot of work around that to figure out which is the best option, and maybe it's a combination of things. But hopefully they come to something, because I think the public service broadcasting, free to air broadcasting, is very important for that trust in media and access to information, all of that.
I mean, as an American, I think I place a high degree of value on the BBC, because we don't have something like this in the US, and I think that would definitely improve our media ecosystem over in that country. So, but yes, the license fee being a sort of area of debate. It sounds like what Keir Starmer is saying is that, look, we'll look at arrangements, but we're not shuttering anything until 2027, once the current arrangement expires, and then we'll consider maybe the future of it when we get to that point.
Yeah, so it is one of the bulkier items in the Labour government in tray. I'm sure they've got a lot to work on, but we'll keep you posted on that. And as we move to the end of the podcast, there are a couple of stories this week that we're not going to be able to discuss in as much detail. Jack, what else should people be aware of?
In TV news, UKTV has launched its U masterbrand with its biggest multimedia campaign ever, spearheaded by singer Cher. In publisher news, the second auction of Telegraph Media Group began this week. Lord Rothermere, the owner of Daily Mail, parent DMGT, has pulled out of the running. In agency news, Omnicom reported 5.2% organic growth in Q2, including 7.8% organic growth in its advertising and media business. In tech news, adtech company Taboola has struck a deal with Apple to power native advertising within the Apple News and Stocks apps. And finally, a peak audience of 24.2 million watched or streamed the Euro 2024 final on a TV set on Sunday across ITV and the BBC, with an average of 22.3 million watching the match from 8 p.m. until the final whistle. And that must have been quite a few million disappointed fans, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Jack. That's all we have time for. But until next time, thanks for joining.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks again for listening to the Media Leader podcast. If you like what you hear, guess what? You can read our stuff at our website, themedialeader.co.uk, where you can sign up to our daily newsletter in the UK of analysis, opinion and commentary about what's going on in media and advertising. You can also find us on YouTube. We are posting video interviews and clips from our live events. And don't forget to check out our LinkedIn page, which is often a very interesting way to see what people in the industry are saying about our articles and the issues that we write about. Anyway, get back to work. Catch you next time. Bye-bye.